First of all, I want to thank you for being interested in helping us out with hospital runs. As a staff member, some of you do hospital runs often and some of us don't. We hear about it in volunteer training and then we go about our business and don't usually have to worry about that on a day-to-day basis. So you're probably watching this hoping to get some more information on the clarity of how a hospital run works. And I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll feel empowered to go out and do that. I think the first thing that you probably are wondering is like, what am I getting myself into? What does the process look like? And that's a good question. So as a staff runner, you would be a backup runner. So typically we have a volunteer who would cover the primary run, and the hours are typically Monday through Friday, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. or on the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So hopefully there will be a primary volunteer runner who would get called, but sometimes those runners can't go out. Either they've been called out already and are on a run, they get sick, something happens. So that's why we need that backup person to be able to go. So as you volunteer to help cover hospital runs, there's a couple of general guidelines you want to follow. First of all, you will want to make sure your phone is not on silent for the hours you're signed up on. You want to make sure that you're not drinking during those hours because you may be called out at any point, and we of course want to make sure that you are safe as you're driving. You want to try to be in close proximity. This means like over the weekend, it's probably not a good time to take a day trip to somewhere that's further away. You probably want to hang around the area so you can get to the hospital as quickly as possible. So you'll want to stay in the Northern Kentucky, Cincinnati area. So let's say that you've signed up for a backup hospital run and you get the call. The general process works like this. Our shelter overnight or on the weekend will receive a call from one of the local St. Elizabeth Hospital emergency rooms. That includes Covington, Fort Thomas, Edgewood, Grant County, and Florence. They will call and give the shelter general information about the survivor who is needing our support. So they'll say if it's a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault or both, usually the survivor's name and probably their age. So if when the shelter receives that information, they're going to attempt to call the primary runner. So usually the volunteer. If there is one, sometimes there's not one that's signed up. In that case, it might be you. So if the volunteer is not available, they will call you to go and let you know the basic information that they've received from the hospital. You should know that as a staff runner, you will typically only be called for sexual assault runs because of Kentucky state law, which states that we are required to respond to a sexual assault that is presenting in an emergency room. Even if the client or the hospital says that they don't want to speak to anyone, we still send a runner anyway. That's simply because sometimes the client may change their mind, and we want to be sure that we're available for support and advocacy if needed. Every once in a while, you may get called for a domestic violence run. I think it's important to remember that victims of sexual assault could be assaulted by a intimate partner, so it could be both. We could be seeing something when we get a call or hearing something that says that we really feel like it's important to send an advocate. If you get a call for a domestic violence run, I think it's smart to check in with the shelter staff and just say, hey, like, have you attempted phone counseling? Sometimes they just need a little reminder that they need to do that instead of calling you, or they may say, hey, we really think you need to go. So you may be prepared to go on that run. So once you receive that call, you will travel to the hospital. When you arrive at the emergency room, you're going to call a shelter and let them know that you're there. When the hospital calls the shelter to let them know that they have a survivor who is in need of support, they will call the hotline number. And that's the number that anyone would call 24 hours a day. So that's the same number that you will want to call when you are communicating back and forth about your run. So for example, when you get to the hospital and you want to report, you'll want to call the hotline number. And as a reminder, that number is 859-491-3335. And that's the number you can use if you have any questions as you go throughout the process. Sometimes the hotline number is also the 1-800 number, which is 1-800-928-3335. It's important to note that those two numbers, the 859 number and the 1-800 number, go to the same place 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The next step, of course, is just to walk into the emergency room. And that brings up a good point about parking. You can usually park in the emergency room parking lot, which is the closest. No one's usually going to ask you any questions about that, and just walk right into the emergency room. There's going to be a triage desk. This is typically where there's a registration worker or a nurse sitting and receiving people who are walking into the emergency room. All you need to do is walk up to the desk and simply say, "I'm here from the Women's Crisis Center. I received a call to come." They usually know exactly where to send you. If not, I think something you can do is you can mention the name of the survivor, and usually they'll go, "Oh, okay," or they're able to check in with somebody. Very rarely should you be questioned about who you are or why you're there by just saying that you're from Women's Crisis Center. They should know you're coming. Okay, so you've checked in at the emergency room at the triage desk, and that person's gonna admit you into the actual emergency room. So those doors are usually automated. They usually press a button behind the desk that will open up the doors and let you in. So then you'll walk in, and usually the first thing you see when you walk into the emergency room is a nurse's desk. And it's usually in the middle, and there's usually lots of people you'll know. Like, you'll see a bunch of nurses. So usually what I do is I check in there too. You can say, "Hey, I'm Reagan. I'm from Women's Crisis Center. I'm here to see this patient that you guys called about," and they'll point you in the right direction and let you know what room they're in, if you can go in then. And a lot of times the nurse will even walk you there and introduce you to the survivor that you're meeting with. So after you're in the room, there's a few important things that you'll want to do. First and foremost, you'll want to introduce yourself to the client. And when you introduce them, I think it's always important to remind them of the limits of confidentiality and explain why you're there. Sometimes that's been explained to them before you came. Many times it has not been. So they should have a heads up that you're coming, but sometimes just the way the emergency room works and it goes so quickly, they don't always know. So something simple along the lines of this example could be helpful. "Hi, my name is Reagan and I'm from Women's Crisis Center. Did anyone let you know I would be coming? Great. I'm here to support you and try to help answer any questions you may have. Everything we talk about is confidential, except if you tell me about child abuse or neglect, abuse of a vulnerable adult, or if you want to harm yourself or someone else." It's also important to remember that everything we talk about, just you and I, is confidential. However, we're in a busy room and there's lots of people that come in and out. So information that you may share with me in front of a medical professional or a police officer, anyone who may enter the room, is no longer privileged or confidential. Do you have any questions? It's important to realize that maybe the victim may be choosing to report to the police. If the victim tells you something away from the police, you are not required to release that information to the police. The exception being if they were to tell you about child abuse or neglect, then that might be something that you would have to share. But the police may try to ask you questions about what the victim shared with you, and I think that's the simple answer to them, which could be, "I'm so sorry, what I talked about with them is confidential." Or I've said in the past something along the lines of, "I don't know, you'll have to ask them." I think the next step after you explain the limits of confidentiality and try to answer any questions that the survivor may have is to explain a little bit about Women's Crisis Center and why you're there. If you're there for a sexual assault run, it's, I think, helpful to explain to them that by law, the hospital has to call Women's Crisis Center and we have to report and provide the option for support and advocacy. Domestic violence, it's important if you're called for a domestic violence run without sexual assault, that is not required by law. That's just a courtesy, but you can explain the role Women's Crisis Center plays with domestic violence survivors. One of the best ways to do that is to go over the services that Women's Crisis Center offers. So it can be pretty simple. You don't have to give an entire exhaustive laundry list of what we do. You could talk about, with a sexual assault survivor, you want to highlight that we provide crisis counseling, that we have the hotline, that we do legal advocacy if they needed help navigating the legal process of reporting the sexual assault, or having emotional support if the report was to turn into a more exhaustive legal process like a trial, that our crisis counseling is available at our outreach office, that they could walk in for services without having to call ahead of time, that they could call the hotline overnight or during the day or 24/7 to get support, and they could do that anonymously. With a domestic violence survivor, you would want to talk about shelter, that's available for individuals who are fleeing intimate partner violence specifically. You can provide little pieces of information to kind of describe what we're able to do. A client may have a question about a service that you're not sure about, and that's okay. I think you can always refer them back to the hotline, and to call during certain hours for certain things. So if they're specifically asking about counseling or an outreach service, to call between 8 and 8 Monday through Friday, just giving them that direction. And a little bit, we'll go over materials that you can take with you that could be really helpful. During this process, as you're introducing yourself, this could look a little different depending on where the hospital is in their process. You could have arrived before the sexual assault nurse examiner has arrived, so you could be waiting with the individual before that person is there to start the forensic exam. You could arrive at a similar time or after the nurse has arrived. So explaining these things may be punctuated between different things that have to happen. And sometimes, we just have to be patient with that process. If you're there beforehand, it's a great opportunity to build rapport with the person that you're meeting with and understand what would be helpful for that person. And every person's different. They may be interested in hearing what you have to say. They may say, I'm okay. Sometimes you'll walk into a room with many people, not just the survivor. Secondary victims are often present at the hospital. That could be parents, it could be friends, it could be a supportive partner. It just depends. And you can provide support to those people as well when appropriate at the exam or during the time at the hospital. And that support for both parties, the primary victim and the secondary victim, is similar. We want to be empathetic and provide active listening. Sometimes people want to talk about what's happened. Sometimes the survivor wants to talk about what's occurred, and we can just be present and provide our empathy to them. And sometimes they don't, but then sometimes the secondary victim does. I think being aware of where those conversations happens is important. Asking if people are comfortable with certain people in the room while they're talking about it, if you need to have a separate conversation in a different location. There's usually a lot of questions that people have during this process. Questions about the exam that they may be trying to decide if they're going to have or not, about the legal process. Sometimes you'll know those answers, sometimes you won't. I think it's important for you to realize that you can't remember every piece of information or have all of the knowledge that is involved in this process, but you can do the best you can. And sometimes we just have to say, I don't know the answer to that right now, but I can try to help you find the answer. We want to help people feel comfortable as much as possible with us and build rapport with them. Trying to make them comfortable in what's a very uncomfortable situation the best we can. This could be simple things like asking if the client needs a drink or if they need a blanket. Now, a note about offering a drink with a sexual assault exam: if they're choosing to have the forensic exam, you will want to make sure with the patient and with the nurse that it's okay for them to take a drink, because sometimes the forensic evidence from has to be taken from the mouth, and if you take a drink, that could compromise that evidence. So you want to make sure that where they're in the process, that person can have a drink. You would want to kind of talk about what may be helpful for them from you while you're there. Explain what you can do. Hey, I can be here for any part of the exam that you're comfortable with, or any part of the process that you're comfortable with. You can wait in the waiting room until they're ready to maybe talk a little bit more at a certain point during the exam. Giving the client lots of options about how you can be there and be supportive is important. I think it's important to end that process. Let's say that the patient is giving you permission to be present during the SAFE exam, the sexual assault forensic exam, that you practice ongoing consent with them, checking in with them, making sure that they still feel comfortable with you there during certain portions of the exam. And I will go over in a little bit what the different parts of the exam are. But at some points, different clients may want you to step out and then step back in, or stand at a certain place in the room, maybe at the head of the bed where the client's head is instead of at the foot of the bed. I think being aware of that and asking those questions is very important in building trust with the client you're working with and making sure they feel comfortable with what you're providing. Another important guideline as you are getting ready to go out on this hospital run is, what am I going to wear? Usually you will be called late at night or early in the morning. So making that decision ahead of time is important. You don't want to go in your pajamas because you want to provide a good professional image of Women's Crisis Center and our services. But at the same time, you don't want to be overdressed or wear a Women's Crisis Center t-shirt. We would want to stay away from a Women's Crisis Center t-shirt simply because of safety. You're there to act as an advocate and support, but you never know who could be in the waiting room or outside and could be wanting to ask you questions. It's not often that an abuser is there, but just to keep everybody safe, we want to avoid anything that could create any sense of lack of safety for you and for the survivor. So I would say a casual outfit, jeans, a nice shirt, something you're comfortable in that will also help you be relatable and approachable to the person you're working with. There's a lot of acronyms that happen when we talk about a hospital run. I think it's important to recognize that two of the most common acronyms that you will hear are SAFE and SANE. The SAFE exam is the actual exam that the person undergoes for a sexual assault. So SAFE stands for Sexual Assault Forensic Exam. And then the SANE is the forensic nurse, Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner. It's important to note that St. Elizabeth has been also dispatching SANE nurses, Sexual Assault Nurse Examiners, to provide DOVE exams, which is a domestic violence exam. So if you're called on a domestic violence run for some reason, then you may still have a SANE nurse, a forensic nurse, present. So what are some of the basic things that may be helpful in guiding a conversation with the client that you are meeting at the hospital? I think it's important to remember that every single client is different in what they're going to express that they need or how they're going to present with you. Some clients will immediately let you know that they do not want to talk about what's happened and they're maybe not looking for much support from you at the time. And that's okay. Other clients will want to tell you the entire story of what happened or what's been going on, and you will want to be prepared for that as well. Some people are just open to a conversation. So how can you open that conversation? My favorite question to ask anyone that I'm sitting with is, what would be the most helpful for you today? Some people immediately know what that is and can say, I have a lot of questions about making a report to the police, or I'm not quite sure what I need to do from here. That can kind of give you a starting point of where you can go. Some people might say, I don't know what's helpful for me right now. And I think validating for that for them is important. Saying something along the lines of, wow, yeah, this has been a really long day or night for you. I'm sure it's hard to think about what might be helpful right now. Let me maybe talk about some options with you. So kind of being ready to have some options available about what could be helpful. Some people may not want to talk about anything related to the incident that brought them in. Maybe they need to talk about something else. Engaging with them about what's on the TV in the room. Asking them what they like to do. It could also just be using clues around you. I'm thinking about a lot of times I will be with a client and they've got their headphones into their phone. I think a great question to ask them is, what kind of music do you listen to or are you listening to? And people are usually interested in telling you about that. You could even just say, well, do you need a distraction? And they may say, yes, I do. And you can find something interesting to tell them, maybe something you saw recently on TV, or an experience that you recently had, or asking them about something maybe they've recently done. You also will want to avoid certain things. Don't ask why questions is the first one, and I think most of us know that. And that's easy to want to do. Like, the first question that pops into my head is, why are you here today? You can ask a similar question. What brought you in today? Would you like to tell me a little bit about what's been going on? A hard one to do often is to stay off your cell phone while you're trying to have these conversations. Just to text somebody, or, you know, we're so used to being on our phones, it's hard to not do that. However, let's go back to the scenario where somebody wants a distraction. A cell phone could be an excellent distraction. Maybe you pull up like the funny YouTube video that you saw the day before. That could provide a good distraction. So just being mindful of how you use your cell phone. Avoiding personal disclosure is also important. A lot of times clients may ask for that, or we will want to tell a client about a similar experience we've been through. It's natural as humans to want to connect in that way, and sometimes it's appropriate and sometimes it's not. I would say most of the time when somebody is freshly experienced trauma and they're at the hospital, personal disclosure is not appropriate at the time. But then again, maybe you're talking about a distraction or needing to, you know, help the client stay think about something else. Then you might talk about the trip to Kings Island you took a week ago. Maybe that's something that could be helpful. It's also sometimes important that we're mindful of how we're responding to clients and what kind of advice or opinion we're giving. Usually we don't want to give a personal opinion about what a client should do. Clients will ask us what we think they should do, and that can be really hard to say, I'm sorry, I can't tell you what you need to do, and being prepared to handle that. I think a good trick here is to say something along the lines of, hey, you know, what I would do or what I think is important is not always the same or the best for other people. What option, like, we can go over options that might be helpful for you here. And going over maybe some of the options that have been discussed before. Something else that often arises is safety when it comes to working with the victims that we meet in the hospital. That looks a little different between a sexual assault run and a domestic violence run. For someone who is experiencing sexual assault, we want to assess for safety. Is it safe for you to go home tonight? Do you have a safe place to go? What would you need to feel safe are good questions. It looks a little different sometimes, or many times with sexual assault. They may know the person who sexually assaulted them, but it's not somebody they live with. There are the occasions where you go on a dual run, a sexual assault and domestic violence run, and in that case, we do want to talk about safety and where they're going. Is the person that has hurt them at home? If so, where can they go home tonight? Is that person still there? Do they need to find somewhere else to go? Do they have a friend or family member they can stay with? Or do they need shelter? Let's say that you are working with somebody who has experienced some form of intimate partner violence, including sexual assault or not. You could start the process of getting them connected with shelter. Now, it's not your job to do a shelter assessment, so keep that in mind. You don't need to launch into all of that. I think a lot of times it's just making sure that you get them on the phone with shelter. You could start that conversation on the phone with shelter, help them dial the hotline, say, hey, it's so-and-so. I'm here at the hospital on the run. The client's expressing a need for shelter. Here, let me have you talk to them and talk about the process from here. You shouldn't have to be conducting the shelter assessment on your own, but it is important to kind of remember some of the Women's Crisis Center shelter guidelines. So to be eligible for Women's Crisis Center shelter, you need to be fleeing intimate partner violence. So that would be husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, intimate partner. So sometimes you may have a situation where you learn about non-intimate partner violence. I think, trying to help people get connected with other possible resources could be good, and that means you could call the shelter and ask for some resources for someone who isn't experiencing intimate partner violence but needs shelter. Now let's say it is intimate partner violence and they are seeking shelter. Again, getting them online with on the hotline with a shelter advocate to start that process is good, but keeping in mind that getting into shelter can be dependent on multiple things. It could be dependent on our space in shelter and if that's available. It could be dependent on previous shelter history. Unfortunately, sometimes some past clients cannot go back to shelter for certain reasons, or the person's current needs. If somebody has for example, an intense medical need that we cannot meet at the shelter because we're not medically equipped, then we may be making referrals elsewhere or seeking other options for them. So I think it's important when you're talking about shelter to someone that you never guarantee someone shelter. Saying like something along the lines of like, well, it sounds like that shelter could be an option for you. To find out more about that, let's get you on the hotline with a shelter advocate. Other safety planning we want to talk about is the option of a protective order. Protective orders in Kentucky are available for all types of situations, which is great. So you'll hear about there being two different types of protective orders. There's an emergency protective order and an interpersonal protective order. The emergency protective order, or an EPO, is available for different family members. So that could be that could include parent to child or grandparent to grandchild, people who have been married or are married, people who have lived together, or someone who has a child in common would be eligible for that emergency protective order. And then for the interpersonal protective order, that's for victims of dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And talking to somebody about a protective order and how they can get one, so they can go to the circuit clerk's office or the county clerk's office and file that, or if it's during the week and it's Monday through Friday, coming to Women's Crisis Center and we can help them start that process as well. You don't have to know all the details about how a protective order hearing goes, but that they could be eligible if they have been experienced domestic violence, the fear of being hurt by someone, have experienced sexual assault, have experienced stalking, have experienced dating violence in some form, where they have felt like that they were in physical danger, that they could be eligible and that they can follow the process of trying to file a protective order. Again, I'm going to go over materials that could be helpful that could also help explain some of that information for the client as well. So a review of EPOs and IPOs, so emergency protective orders and interpersonal violence orders in the state of Kentucky. People who are qualified for an EPO or an emergency protective order are family members or partners who have been married, live together, or have a child in common. And for an IPO, those would be victims of dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And for both of these, this is where somebody feels like they have been in physical danger or have been physically harmed because of the actions of the other person. It's important that you note that somebody can file in the state of Kentucky a protective order where the incident occurred or where the client is living. So, for example, the incident could have happened in Kenton County, but the person lives in Campbell County. They could file in Kenton or Campbell County. Now, we live in a area that's close to other states, including Indiana and Ohio, and their laws are going to vary from Kentucky laws. For example, if the person lives in Ohio, and they want an Ohio protective order, the best thing you can do is refer that person back to the domestic violence program in the area that they're coming from where they want to file the order. So for Cincinnati residents, you're going to refer them back to Women Helping Women. As far as support from Women's Crisis Center when it comes to protective orders, we provide legal advocacy out of our outreach office, and we can do a few things. We can help people complete protective orders. We can meet them at the courthouse and help them do that. They can come to our office Monday through Friday and try to complete one at the office for Kenton, Campbell, and Boone counties at the 835 Madison office. Now it's important to note that to file one in court, you have to complete a protective order before 4 p.m. when the clerk's office is closed. Now, protective orders should be available 24 hours a day, so we can always help the client try to contact the police to try to file the order after 4 p.m. if they would like. If you would like more information when it comes about protective orders and protective orders in the state of Kentucky, we are providing a link below from KCADV, or the Kentucky Coalition Against Domestic Violence, about EPOs, IPOs, and the process in the state of Kentucky. Just talking through options with people as far as safety planning, I think another good thing is to help the client remember how they've stayed safe in the past. Many times, we have had clients who've experienced trauma previously, or have experienced previous domestic violence incidents. I think relying on their expertise is a great way to engage in this conversation. So talking to them about what has helped keep you safe in the past. Is that something that you can continue to do? What have you done previously when you've been in similar situations? Clients will usually give us good information, and we can encourage them to continue doing some of those safety planning activities. And it could also just be going over a safety plan with them when you have information that you might want to share with them. There's a safety planning brochure, and it can talk about if you're planning to leave, what are some of the things that you would want to be aware of, what are some documents you would want to have, what would you maybe want to pack. And that brings up an important point of identifying where a client, what their goal is when it comes to safety. Again, with domestic violence, are they currently in this relationship? Are they currently living with this person? What is their goal? Do they want to stay in the relationship? Do they want to leave the relationship? Have they already left the relationship? And helping them kind of think about safety when it comes to each of those different goals they may have. Now going back to safety planning with a sexual assault survivor who was assaulted by someone who isn't their intimate partner. Sometimes it's talking about emotional safety with them and helping them identify what can help them emotionally when they're going through this process. Helping them identify friend or family supports that they could talk to. Who's somebody safe that you feel like you could talk to if you needed it? If they're struggling, offering them options like the crisis hotline, the Women's Crisis Center crisis hotline, or the crisis text line, making sure that they feel like they have an option to reach out to someone if they were in need of support and needed to talk. Helping them think about activities that help them feel better, coping skills. So do they like listening to music? Do they like watching movies? Do they engage in crafting activities? Do they exercise? Like, what are some of those things that they could go to if they needed it? I usually assess for suicide with most of the hospital runs I go on, just to be safe. The hospital usually and should be assessing as part of the emergency room intake process. However, this is an overwhelming process and people are going through a lot, so I always will check in with them and say, hey, I like to check in with people who are going through a difficult time. Are you thinking about ending your life or harming yourself? So maybe you're overwhelmed by checking in on this process or in the process of assessing someone for suicide. I think it's important to remember that asking someone if they're having suicidal thoughts, thinking about harming themselves, ending their own life, will not make them more suicidal. Most of the time it's actually just opening a door for conversation and allowing them the opportunity to get more information about resources available for them, and many people in crisis want that. So if you are afraid of that happening, I think it's important to remember that really it's more helpful than hurtful. And people will usually be very honest with you, and if they say yes, I think that it's appropriate to maybe engage the medical staff and let them know, like, hey, they've let me know that they're struggling with some suicidal thoughts. Can you help me? Or if they could say yes, but I'm not planning to do anything, I don't want to hurt myself, you can say, great, how can you get help? Could you get help if you started to think about this more, or if it became more of a problem? Engaging them in identifying people they could talk to, or if they could reach out to the crisis text line or the Women's Crisis Center line or the suicide hotline. giving them options. So that emotional safety planning piece is just as important as that physical safety planning piece for many people. For more information about safety planning, you can scroll below and see links to different detailed safety planning information that can help guide conversations with individuals you may be working with. So we've talked about the process of entering the hospital, engaging with the survivor, questions you can ask to build rapport. And in a minute, I'll go through the details of what's involved in a safe exam. But you may be wondering, how do I know that my advocacy at the hospital has concluded? There's a couple of things that could happen. One, the client could elect for you to stay throughout the exam process. So when the client completes the exam and is ready to leave, is maybe collecting discharge papers or getting the last information they need to leave, that usually means it's time for you to go. You could conclude with, is there anything else that would be helpful from me? Is there anything else that you may need? And if you've provided what you need or you finish up, the client will be like, no, I'm great, and usually can naturally make your way out. Another option, of course, is that you've entered the hospital, you've introduced yourself, explained what Women's Crisis Center does, and the client could indicate that they don't want you to stay, that they're good, they've got the support they need, or they're not interested at this time. So you may leave before the exam even begins. If they seem a little unsure about what they want, you could always offer and say, I can wait in the waiting room until if you change your mind. The client might say yes, or I would like to talk to you after the exam's completed, so you could just wait in the waiting room until they're done. Or they just, again, or say no. Something I always do before I leave, whether it's that the exam has been completed or that the client has said no, I always check out with one of the nurses that is working with the patient, whether it's the same nurse or the nurse assigned to the patient, and just say, hey, I'm done. The client got all that they needed. If you need anything else, you can call the hotline again. The client may decide later, maybe you were there, they're adamant that they don't need you, they're good. There could be this situation where the client is intoxicated and maybe can't be given an exam yet, and they don't know when the exam can be done, so you need to leave. I would say that's a rare occasion, but you could be aware that that could happen. But let's say something happens and the client changes their mind, or they would like for you to come back. If you let the nurse know that they can call the hotline again, or let the patient know too, hey, if you change your mind, if you need anything more, you can call the hotline and we can send somebody back out, or have somebody talk to you on the phone. That can be another way to make sure that they're aware that services can be continuing. Something that might be helpful upon leaving or when you're engaging with a client is just being aware of different resources that you could take with you. Something that's helpful that you can take with you on a run to help provide you with resources that you can give to the client that you're working with is to take some items with you. In Covington, we make up a little manila envelope. We're happy to share these with staff members. You can come by and pick a couple up. We could send some to you interdepartmental mail, whatever would be helpful for you. But inside of our little manila envelope, we have a few things. We always have a Women's Crisis Center brochure. This is helpful because it has the hotlines on the back and the 2 walk-in locations in Northern Kentucky and in Maysville ready to go, and also does a brief introduction to what we do in some of our services. The other resource that could be very helpful for a client in particular is this Help Is Here. The Help Is Here brochure goes over all of the mandatory referral and education information for the state of Kentucky. So where we used to do spousal abuse reporting, we now do the mandatory education and referral information, which just means that you need to provide information about how to contact the Domestic Violence or Rape Crisis Center in the area, how to file a protective order, and some educational information about domestic violence. So inside of it, it provides all of that. It goes over definitions of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, and stalking. It talks about what we provide at Women's Crisis Center, how to get a protective order, and then also, again, the contact information, as well as the office hours, which could be helpful. We also provide information about VINE. There's 2 different pieces of VINE information. VINE is a resource that clients can use if their offender has been arrested or if they have a protective order. So it helps provide information about offender status and court hearings. So if the client can go online and sign up to either be called or send an email about any changes in the offender status or hearings that might be coming up related to the offender who perpetrated the crime against them. It also can be a way to register a protective order if they obtain one, and receive notifications related to that as well. It also can be helpful. This brochure has some information about just different Kentucky victim services throughout the state that a client might need. Also, there is a safety plan, and that could be helpful for you or for the client to talk about some different safety planning options. And then finally, if you are a staff member going on a sexual assault run and the client would like for someone to follow up with them, you can obtain a consent for follow-up services. They would just provide their name, a phone number, and sign off that they would like for somebody to follow up with them. And if they are, if you would just bring this to the outreach office, we will have an advocate follow up with the individual to talk about services and resources that may be helpful for them. An important thing to note about any of these resources is making sure it's safe for somebody to take these home. So if they're in a situation where maybe they're returning to a home where there's an offender or could be unsafe to take something, finding ways for them to maybe have the hotline number without it being visible on maybe a brochure, seeing if there's a friend or family member who could keep the information for them if they would like. The hospital will often also provide some information about Women's Crisis Center in a safe place. They usually give out a chapstick that says St. Elizabeth on it, but has the Women's Crisis Center hotline on it. You could also maybe even help them program it into their phone under something else. Just thinking about safety when providing resources could be helpful. Okay, so you've provided the information, the client has decided that they don't need you anymore or the exam has concluded, you're able to leave the hospital. When you're leaving the hospital, you will want to call the hotline, so the shelter usually again, and let them know that you're leaving. They're going to ask you some details about what you learned on the run. Like I said, they're usually going to have the name of the person already and an idea if it's domestic violence or sexual assault, maybe an age or birth date. And you're going to do your best to fill in other blanks. Do you know what county that they lived in? Who was the offender? What was their relationship to them? A brief summary of the incident that brought them into the hospital. If they received medical attention, was it reported to the police? If so, what police was it reported to? They're going to ask you some of those questions. Now, you're going to remember some of it. You may not remember all of it, and that's okay. You're just going to do your best to provide the information that you can remember. And so you're then able to go home and hopefully have time to go back to bed or maybe get ready for work. So if you went on a sexual assault run, I think it's important to remember that you'll also need to complete the Healing Voices survey. If you were present during any medical support that the client received or during any legal support that the client received. So if you're in the room with the client when they received support from a nurse or a doctor, or if you were present when they made a police report and the police were present, you'll want to fill out these surveys. There's two ways to do that, and we will link that below. One is you can print off a copy of the survey and take it to the Covington office, or you can complete a Google survey version of the survey and submit it that way. So you have two options to be able to complete that, and if you can complete that as soon as possible after your run, that's great. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to the outreach office, and we are happy to answer any of the questions you may have. All right, so we talked about the process of what you do when you go and provide advocacy support as a hospital runner, but you're probably curious, what does the SANE exam, the SAFE exam, the sexual assault forensic exam, or the DOVE exam, the domestic violence exam involve? So the SANE nurse will guide the client through both of these exams in collecting the evidence. And they should remind the client at the beginning of the exam that their consent is ongoing. They have control over what parts of the exam are completed and not. So the client can always decline if they do not want a certain part of the exam completed. You can remind them of this as well. The first part that typically occurs is a narrative of the incident and a history of past experiences with domestic violence or sexual assault. This is verbally given by the nurse, and it goes through various questions. again, the client can choose what questions they want to respond to, what questions they don't want to respond to. Then there's typically a head to toe examination by the nurse. This is just the nurse kind of examining the person head to toe, looking for anything that may indicate the violent incident that has occurred. So bruising, cuts, anything that may be helpful for them. If they notice anything, then the nurse is going to try to do documentation of the injury and collection of evidence. So documentation of the injury is usually photos. Again, the client can consent or not consent to what photos they feel comfortable being taken. And then collection of evidence is different for each exam. If it was a sexual assault exam, there's usually different DNA samples that need to be taken to be able to identify the victim's DNA compared to the perpetrator's DNA, and then as well as collecting any evidence that may be left behind using swabs in different areas indicated by the patient that were involved in the assault. And then finally, for the sexual assault exam, there's typically a discussion about prophylaxis treatment for sexually transmitted infections and pregnancy prevention for sexual assault as well. So the nurse is going to talk about options that the client has to receive antibiotics, testing, and then treatment as well. So they offer the Plan B pill, and the client has the option for that. They offer, again, antibiotics for treatment of STIs that may be contracted. And they're also going to talk about HIV and the HIV prophylaxis, NPEP, and that's usually something that they talk a lot about the pros and cons with. It can be a very difficult process, and the nurse will walk the patient through those questions. And then at the very end of the exam, when all of this has been completed, the nurse will discuss follow-up care and what might need to happen. Usually they're going to be referred back to a physician, either the primary care physician, maybe a gynecologist if it's a female survivor of sexual assault, to receive follow-up care for any injuries that may have been noted, or just for overall health. And the nurse will usually provide some paperwork about that and send the client home.